Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome. I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and it's such a pleasure to be with you right now. A quick word about the EA, who we are and what we do. We are a learned society and a subject association for English. We were founded in 1906 to support, promote, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education from primary and early years through secondary and further to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you so much to Maud and Cillian for being so generous with your time. You will introduce yourselves properly in a moment. Our members, I must thank them as well because they also make it possible for us to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. Memberships start from just £29 for the year, which enables you to support our campaigning and advocacy work, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. And that's enough from me because now it's time to start our conversation about using AI responsibly in assessment. So, Cillian, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Th- Thank you very much, Becky, and apologies everyone because the technical difficulties were my fault. I'm just going to check because you can be involved in AI and still not know how to have an internet connection, apparently. I'm just going to check everyone can see that. I can see if people, yes, fantastic, Becky. Well, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Cillian Ó Fathaigh. I just want to begin by thanking Becky for the invitation, as well as Joe Heathcott as well for putting this together and helping put it together, as well especially Maud for all of the work we've been doing together and for speaking alongside me as well. We've sort of divided the talk up into me doing the abstract theoretical stuff and Maud showing how it works at the cold face and the concrete things and how it works in practice. So you'll probably find what she says much more interesting than me, but if you could just bear with me, there's loads of nice images of wrappers. So using AI responsibly in assessment, I'll look under the hood. So what I wanted to do today was actually look about AI design, the design of these assessment tools, and give some vocabulary about how to understand what's going on with them when we use them, and also when we choose not to use them. So just a bit about my background. So I'm an assistant professor in philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, as well as a visiting research fellow at King's College London, where I used to be a lecturer. My PhD is in French, and just recently I've been PI on a large AI and pedagogy survey of academics across Europe, which has turned out to be the biggest survey of third level academics across Europe. So we've got some very interesting responses we're just dealing with at the moment, and I can share a little bit with you as well as a little sneak peek of all of the horrible facts which have emerged from the survey. Um, Alongside that, this March I founded an AI assessment tool for second level called Pulc.Ai, and I wanted to share some of my experiences of building that, designing it alongside teachers, as well linking that to the sort of philosophical questions. So just to give a little brief overview of that before we get into the key themes. So Pulc.Ai is an AI assessment tool. It's free in classrooms for both teachers and students. It's focused on formative feedback as well as exam preparation for students. So we launched it in March in Ireland, and it's corrected or helped mark 30,000 essays with formative feedback and a grade, and about 10,000 students and teachers are using it. And it's based on real students' essays corrected by real teachers as well. So that's where it might distinguish itself from other tools available, but that's also how it can give valuable feedback and help support teachers in their work. Um, why I thought it would be useful to look under the hood of this is a few reasons. So first of all, to look at some of the principles of what I call human-centric AI as a type of responsible AI, as well as to get a vocabulary to discuss that and to articulate both our concerns and the promises around that, to show some of the conflict that can occur in designing a tool like this and maybe expose some of that which can sometimes be papered up, and particularly to support a vocabulary for seeing through some of the marketing rhetoric that you can see in some of these tools, and we'll maybe get to that. But so it's more to give something of an insight into the nitty gritty, as well as the sort of philosophical principles that govern what I've been trying to do with Pulc, but also what other people are trying to do with AI and assessment, and the decisions that you're all making practically on your day-to-day engagement or lack of engagement with AI. So this is how Pulc works very briefly. On the left-hand side, it copies handwritten text, converts this into digital text, and then creates formative feedback that teachers can edit or delete or add to as well. So that's the basics of the tool. So to begin with talking about AI and AI in assessment, I just want to make the point about what AI is. So artificial intelligence has a very, very, very long history. But right now, when we say AI, we're really referring to LLMs or large language models. And to demonstrate how long that history is, this is the textbook. Sorry, things are birds, you might not be able to see that, before ChatGPT. Okay. So this has 1,300 pages. And that's before we get to LLM. So I know when I'm talking to computer science people, they get rather frustrated when we say AI, and actually we really mean a specific type of AI. And with that, one of the more prominent types of AI is machine learning. And I bring that in as a distinction because it's something that you might want to be aware of when you're thinking about which educational tools to use, as to how much they're relying on large language models and how much they're relying on machine learning. Because machine learning, very crudely, is equations that adapt with more data. But importantly, they're deterministic, and large language models are probabilistic. That is to say, with the machine learning, you put in something and you know what you're going to get out. But with the large language model, you put in something and you don't really know what you're going to get out. And you won't necessarily get the same thing the next time you put it in. And this creates problems when using it within education. To keep going with that, this is what we can call the probability problem. This is the first reference to wrappers. And what you can do with AI in terms of large language models, you can adjust the probability setting. So what's called the temperature. And so you can make it potentially more reliable that when you put an X, you'll get out the thing you think you're going to get out. But that reduces how much it can respond to individual feedback. And that's an important point when we're thinking about developing these tools, because the point is that they're supposed to be able to answer any type of essay that a student might provide, or any type of task or answer that they might provide. And so when designing these tools, people have to make a choice between how accurate or reliable they want them to be and how capable they are of responding to the personal essay that they have in front of them, or the particular text or assignment. Another important part of that is that large language models create what are called hallucinations. We'll talk about that a bit more, but effectively they don't provide reliable information. And this is a particular problem when we think about the basic technology of large language models, because their use in education is something of an accident, right? People didn't set out to make an educational tool when they started building large language models. They developed the technology, and now we're at the stage where people are adapting that technology to education. And that doesn't resolve some of the fundamental problems that are there. And the question is how we use those, how we design the tools to make sure that we resolve some of those issues. So that's a broad, general overview of AI. Happy to talk a bit more about that later. One of the key terms I wanted to bring in, which is something you might all be familiar with, is human-centric AI. So there's a lot of discussion about what responsible AI is, what trustworthy AI is. I find human-centric to be much more practical, even if it's a subset of that, because I think it works very well for education in particular. Something that's human-centric solves problems that we actually have, that are things we identify in our lived experience and our daily lives, and we know what the problem is, and then it gives us the solution. One of the big frustrations I've always had with using any technology in education is that it often solves things that are presented as problems that aren't really a problem. Right? They're something that the technology can solve, but they're not necessarily a problem that I have to face. And often they slightly present themselves as solving that problem when they're not really solving the problem, or they're substituting that problem for another set of other problems. So this idea of human-centric AI, I think, is worth holding on to in that respect. And there's the killers. So the question when we're thinking about human-centric AI then is, how many problems do we have? What are our problems? And I think there are three. Obviously, a decline in the status and enrollment for humanities subjects, obviously not just English. With my PhD in French, I've got the linguistic hat on as well. Level of assessment workload, and educational inequality. And there might be many, many more. And I think the point that I would stress, and this is where choice around AI becomes a bit more individual, is how you use large language models in education may depend on what you or even your class identify as a problem. Right? Because human-centric isn't just like there's a set of agreed problems. What we all identify as a problem, as individuals, as a society, as communities, slightly changes then how we want to apply AI or in which context we want to use it. I think that's the last reference to wrap. Sorry about that. I ran out of creativity. So I divided the risks into three categories. As a philosopher, I like breaking things into three categories, but there's actually no real reason to distinguish them all so strongly, but I think it can be useful. So one of the first risks, as I mentioned, is hallucinations. Now that is a fancy term for lying, right? Large language models focus on what is plausible, not necessarily what is accurate. And that's because these models don't really know the world in the way that we do. And so while they might produce something that sounds right, and most importantly, sounds fluent, students, by definition, because they're in the process of learning the thing, can't really notice whether or not it's a hallucination or not. The AI won't communicate how reliable X, Y, or Z is. It'll present everything as equally reliable. And so this survey that we've just done, one of the resounding results, and it was across 7 European countries, was that over 80% of academics have no confidence that their students can accurately assess the output of AI tools. And I think that's important because we often assume that we're a bit behind the curve in relation to our students and technology. And that's certainly true. Someone comes in with a new tool, a new website, a new platform, they pop up all the time. But ultimately, actually, it seems like academics, at least in their own view, are a bit ahead of their students and as they're facing them because they're more capable of assessing the output. Another term that's useful is cognitive offloading, which is connected to de-skilling. Um, if we think about education and one of the purposes of education as enhancing intellectual autonomy or critical thinking, cognitive offloading becomes a place we become dependent on um, on these technologies. Now, I have a colleague in Bologna who's working on these topics as well as other topics, and other colleagues working around cognitive offloading. And one of the things they would stress is that it comes with other skills. For instance, you might become better at finding information. We might become better at managing different tasks. So it's not necessarily all bad, but the question that we have to ask in education is what skills do we want to retain? And are we actually making those decisions about what we would like to retain, what we would like to retrain students in as well? Um, and that key point is that a lot of these AIs are focused on being helpful, but helpful can mean something very different in education than just giving you the answer. So the second risk is more so a category of teaching or the classroom. So how can AI and assessment end up changing our teaching or assessment so that we rather match the machine rather than the machine matching us? And similarly, a conflict in expertise. So if we think about the classroom as a place of trust, as a place of establishing relationships with students, the fact that there is the potential for another outside authority that also presents itself as machine-like, as in some way authoritative because of it, it's a bit of a magic trick to AI. And this can create conflict already between the expertise of the teacher and the supposed expertise of the machine. So that's another risk. And then a third risk is more social. So I think it's fair to say that we're going to see more and more productive tools. The arrival of large language models in the classroom was largely disruptive, but I think one of the shifts we'll see is that we'll have increasingly productive tools. And this will create new divides between better resourced and under resourced schools, where certain schools will be able to pay for better tools that other students won't get access to. There's also a climate impact point, which I won't labor because I'm not going to address here. But just to say, when you're looking at these tools, nearly all of them rely on large providers. So ChatGPT, Google, that are adjusted in some way. Maybe the temperature has changed, maybe they've added on more data, but that is to say the climate impact will be relatively similar. There are ways to change this. One of the points that I've been looking at is small language models, which could eventually run on your own computer in terms of energy resources. This might be much, much more effective and positive. But at the moment, that's not something that is really solved, let's say. And that's the thing. If you see someone presenting a tool as being in some way climate neutral, be highly skeptical because you see certain claims like this. It would be quite remarkable if they had something like that, at least at the moment. I know that Maud is going to talk a little bit about friction and so on. So I just wanted to point out a conflict that you see when dealing with students when you're talking about developing AI tools with them, which is that generally speaking, AI wants to have a copy and paste answer. And it wants to give you something that you can just copy in and says, okay, there's a problem here, and it might be good at identifying it, but then it'll just go, rather than saying, oh, what's that? It'll just give you something to copy and paste. And that has to be designed into the tool to prevent it doing that, because that's what it regards as helpful. And it really sort of wants to help you. It wants to almost baby you, the student. So when you're developing a tool, you have to actively prevent the model from doing that. Rather than it being something you have to train into the model, you have to train out of it. And one of the conflicts there is that people developing tools, especially if they have a commercial focus, want the tool to be used a lot. And so inherently, people will go for potentially easier tools. They'll want the tool as a shortcut in some cases. So it's not always in the interest of the designer to introduce that. And that's something we've resisted quite a bit with Pulc, and sort of been quite fundamental to the way we've been thinking about it. But that's not necessarily common in all apps. I have a rant about Duolingo that I won't go into for time. But if anyone wants to ask me about how I feel about Duolingo, please do. Um, in terms of assessment, again, the tension in design, I think, is clear. So tools can nudge you into assessing in particular ways, or setting particular tasks for assessment. So, for instance, one of the ways of assessment that I think is quite troubling that I see a lot is ranking of students during the process of marking. I think that changes how we understand what a classroom is. I think it is invaluable in terms of a digital divide that we need to keep thinking about. And it creates an idea that assessment is very clearly quantifiable and very clearly hierarchical. And so implicit within these tools can lead to a change in how we're imagining our classroom or how we relate to the classroom as well. And this is where engaging with handwriting can be quite useful, and potentially considering privileging tools when you're making those choices that allow for the use of handwriting, because that already is adapting to the forms of assessment that we usually have. But similarly, um, we need to think about how this is designed for people with, say, dyslexia, or who need additional supports, or don't have, say, English as a first language, which is also a key part of design that needs to be factored in when you're assessing these tools, basically. Um, Finally, I'm saying finally, I'm pretty sure, yes, well, finally, we'll get to that. So there's different ways of framing how in the loop teachers or humans in general are when they deal with AI. And how in the loop you might want to be might depend on what the task is and what the student or who the student is. Because bias for different students might be different. If you write an essay about your summer holidays and your summer holidays were in Nottingham rather than Nigeria, there could be quite a different response there. So how hands-on you want to be when dealing with these tools. The trade-off here is usually between time saved. So you can have an out of the loop AI. Basically, the AI does everything. So sorry, the human is out of the loop. In which case these tools can claim, oh, well, we save an awful lot of time, but at the risk of producing unreliable information, or at the risk of there being large amounts of bias. We can have in the loop or on the loop. And that is just a question of the teacher getting involved and at which stage. So the teacher could edit the feedback before a student sees it, or edit the grade before a student sees it. That would be in the loop, or after the student sees it, which would be on the loop. So then we could have different degrees of oversight there. So that's just another way of thinking about how we engage with these different AIs and the tools. Um, and then finally, and I won't labor this point because it could be part of our discussion as well, is rather than always, so I think it's fair to say AI isn't going to be a silver bullet for education inequality, but it's also worth thinking about how it could be a bullet even further for educational inequality. That is, say, not only how it might be able to help, which I think is an important question, but also how can it make things worse? And I think we already see this with some use in projects where better resource schools are able to give students even more feedback by uploading projects into commercial AI models, and then getting extra feedback on these projects. So that's just another concern. The final point I want to leave us on, rather than being entirely pessimistic, is that I think a very fundamental question that's raised with AI is about why humanities subjects matter. And I think for people who deal with communication every day, who probably regard themselves as very good communicators, we're extremely poor at articulating why our subjects matter. And I obviously French and modern languages would interest me, but I think it's shared across all of the humanities. And I think what AI does is shift that discussion into us thinking about justifications for our subject that are purely intrinsic rather than extrinsic. So thinking about why we need to convince students that the subject matters and why we want them to learn these skills for their own good, for their as an end in themselves, rather than, oh well, we must justify this because it'll look better on an application to university or be better for getting a job. So to focus on when explaining why you should do, say, English, how it's going to enrich all aspects of their lives and why these skills are actually vital for themselves, not just for achieving something. So that is it. I will hand over to Maud now, but thank you very much and would welcome any questions.
Thank you, Cillian. I'm going to um, share my screen, and hopefully um, everybody is going to be able to see that. Yeah, everyone will get great. Thank you. So, thank you, Cillian, for a really insightful talk there. Just a little bit about me before I'm going to just run through a few practical tips about how to use AI with assessment on the ground as a classroom teacher. So I'm currently head of English and media at a school in East London, as well as being chairperson of the Teacher Reference Group, which is an independent advisory board to the Department for Education on policy that is currently being legislated at the department. So I know as teachers across the board, there's a fear around AI and the challenges of integrating it, the loss of agency, the pedagogical friction, and crucially for English, the impact on creativity and accountability. There's also a fear about the breakdown between the teacher-student relationship and the concern I know I feel and my colleagues feel as well about the teacher expertise being undermined and the erosion of the trust between educators and students. As well as that, the third thing that is can be really challenging at the moment is that there is a lack of guidelines and thoughtful implementation around AI, which is essential to maintain that educational integrity, as well as integrating it into the classroom. So just wanted to outline the kind of the fears, I suppose, on the ground. Um, there, there's also, Cillian mentioned earlier, part of this talk is to give some language around how we use AI, and I find this a very useful way to explain, like Cillian was saying previously, to students why they shouldn't always take the shortcut with AI, particularly when we look at English with, let's say, creative writing or extended writing. So this is actually an expression taken from a really interesting educational thinker called Simon Breakspear, and I've linked this article at the end if anyone is interested in listening. And there's a podcast he did, and he makes this analogy between the cognitive stairs and the cognitive elevator. Um, so this idea that if we just allow our students to get on the elevator when times get tough or they can't generate ideas, then we are really doing them a disservice. And I'll come on to link about the digital divide and the impact on outcomes, particularly for poorer students. And those from certain socioeconomic backgrounds. So I just thought that could be a useful analogy for people to, when you're explaining to your students why not to always take the shortcut. We need to take the stairs. So the other thing is having this idea of an AI resistant classroom. So again, I've linked this article. It's very interesting from a professor in English saying that an AI resistant English course has three main elements, which are pen and paper and oral testing, teaching the process of writing rather than just assigning papers, and really making sure that what happens in our classrooms is absolutely integral to our teaching. So that is kind of I'm not going to run through all of that in detail, but there are a few ideas, particularly with teaching the writing process about not just the end product, but emphasis on the drafting, the revising, teaching those critical skills and creativity beyond the AI assistant, and making sure that that can happen in the classroom. So the term AI resistant English course sounds in opposition to the purpose of this talk. So really, why are we having a talk about integrating AI into assessment? And I broke it down into three reasons how AI really can be an amazing tool for teachers, despite the fear, despite the kind of doomsday, often things that we are reading about AI in the education setting. So the first one for all teachers is when it is used well, it can be transformative in terms of teacher workload and marking efficiency. Um, Secondly, it is to reassure people it is not a replacement for teacher expertise. So I'm going to go through some more practical ideas of how you would implement it into your classroom, but the teacher expertise absolutely is not undermined or challenged when it's used correctly. And the third one is it does provide an amazingly accessible tool for both students and teachers. And as Cillian had mentioned earlier, it could really help to reduce educational disparities that we do unfortunately see, particularly when we look at a digital divide amongst students. I've broken it down into the three main types of assessment. This is for actually it could be applied to most humanities subjects. So diagnostic assessment, which for the non-teachers in the talk is detailed feedback where you are usually marking for spelling, punctuation, and grammar, as well as putting comments throughout the essay, summatively marking it, and probably a summative comment. It's a really, students love it. The debate is out about how effective it is in terms of do they bother to read those comments. But it really does build a student-teacher relationship, and they really like to see those personalized comments. So it allows for regular feedback. So it also diagnostic feedback is important around exam times. You often get lots of more students handing you in essays, whether that's the public exam, the mock exams. So there are softwares out there that you can put in your student essays, and they will diagnostically mark that. They will generate the feedback, they will generate the comments, and they will summatively grade it. So it saves the teacher time not writing the comments. However, the teacher should be checking through those comments, potentially tweaking them, personalizing them, but that hard work of writing on the paper has been taken away. Um, so, and there is you can also use it or tell your students to use it to mark their drafts so that they are refining and going through their essays before they then hand you in their final submission. So Pulc really is useful for this because, as Cillian had outlined earlier, it gives those detailed feedbacks. It's based on real student work and teacher marking as well. So you've got that human element to it. So when used correctly, that can be a fantastic tool in terms of diagnostic assessment. For whole class assessment, which again is essentially it's you read the whole class's work and you come up as you're reading with general points of improvement for the class. So you don't necessarily write any comments on the work, but you look for patterns across the work. So with AI, you can put these essays in bulk into the software, and they will come up with those common mistakes across for the feedback and generate them again, really reducing the workload of the teacher. The teacher then reads through those general feedback and then can deliver that and make the resources for their students. So Google Sheets have a really useful AI function. ChatGPT also works, and something called Notion AI can be really effective for this as well. Formative assessment. So again, this is when you are assessing students, not necessarily at the end of a unit or a topic. There's no grade assigned to this, but it's continuous feedback for students. So something I've just started to do, which has been really transformative, is to ensure the personalized and individual comments is voice to text applications. So as you are marking, you speak your feedback for each student or however you see fit, and it converts into text instantly, and it has saved so much time. That text then you can put into a PowerPoint immediately, you can print it off however you see fit. So I've listed, there are lots of these AI softwares out. There's Otter, Speech Notes, Dictation, Gemini, all really, really useful. They format it very nicely for you as well. So that has been a real time saver as well. So those are the three types of assessment where AI, when used effectively can really speed up the process for teachers and free up teachers to really spend time planning their lessons, resourcing, having those individual conversations with student, live marking in the moment. I have put down as well, there are a few obvious ways. I think people are more au fait with these ways of using AI. So planning lessons, planning longer schemes of work. So any documentation that would previously have taken hours can be really quickly formatted into schemes of work documents, quizzes, regular quizzes, which in an AI resistant classroom, quizzing actually, we won't go into it now, but has been shown to be a really, really effective way of making sure that AI is not just summarizing large pieces of text, for example, when students are reading or creating resources, etc. Vocabulary lists, glossaries, study plans, the list is endless in terms of other ways that you can use AI more generally in your teaching to save time and really make sure that you are adaptive teaching for your students. So personalizing things, making sure you're pitching it to the right level. There's lots and different ways that you can do that. So I just wanted to kind of end on looking forward and teaching what essentially is AI literacy. I think that it can be very overwhelming as a teacher. The future is unknown. And it's really fantastic to see people like Cillian who are creating software specifically for education and specifically for the subject English as well. So as he identified earlier, it can feel that there are all these softwares out there, AI softwares, but actually none of it quite fits. I think it is really important that we are demonstrating what AI can do as well as its limitations. So in English, we do a lot around critical thinking skills. We teach bias. And I think it is important that we continue to do that, but with AI generated text, for example, that students don't just accept something that is generated by AI is sounds great, so therefore is fantastic. So I think that in the English classroom, there is a space for that moving forward. And I know it's a more of a national conversation within education, and based on the curriculum review that's just come out from the government, AI literacy and digital literacy is going to be at the forefront of that. So I just wanted to end with that as more as maybe a thought, a thinking point, because I think we're going to take some questions if there are any. And yes, I'll pass back to Cillian and Becky. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those just really interesting sort of provocations, as well as sort of practical sort of view from the classroom type stuff. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I was typing away like mad trying to take notes. So thank you. So I wonder if we do have any questions for the people who are in the room. You can feel free to pop those in the chat box and we will come to them. But I guess I'll just take a little bit of chance privilege while waiting to see if any questions do come along and ask you both, kind of in an ideal world, what would happen with AI in the English classroom? What would you like to see as a kind of ideal space for us working together with AI?
Mo, do you want to answer that first? I think you might have more practical comments than me.
Yeah, well, I would really like to see more investment in edtech in terms of specifically for the classroom and the English classroom. I think that again, not to go hammer the point home, but we are often we use software, for example, in schools that is not fit for schools. It's a business model that does not really cater to the needs of schools, which actually wastes quite a lot of time. And I would say it's the same with AI. There are tools out there, many, many tools, but very few that have specifically, I feel, tried and tested it in the English classroom. I think marking is at the moment the best way in order to I suppose, speed up the efficiency, like I said, and support students and staff. I think on the ground for teachers, anything that's going to save time and free us up to really do our jobs is going to be welcome as well.
And I suppose just this is also maybe a bit more from the university perspective. I think there's probably two images or views of where AI will go with education. So one is around a discourse around personalization, which I think has a view of the classroom implicit in it, that actually classrooms would work better if we were all split up into nice little silos individually, and that the teacher just sort of surveyed things and jumped in if there was a little problem or something like that. I'm quite skeptical of that view. I think it's often um, held by people who've never really taught before or have a limited idea of teaching. But perhaps other people disagree there. But it seems to me exactly saving time on this more or less supplementary tasks of assessing or other aspects like that, administration, and then enabling teachers to just have more time to teach as well as potentially manage larger workloads in terms of larger student classes, which is a particularly big problem in the humanities. I think that's where there's a positive human centric view of AI, where actually you keep the classroom in its similar format and you don't necessarily let it enter into spaces unless you're very confident it's doing something, rather than I think there's a different vision of education in some of these products as well that I'm not very satisfied with.
Thank you. I think what you've both just outlined there is actually quite a nice little, almost kind of guide to assess. If you see an AI tool out there, how do you decide if you want to use it? And it's looking for that subject specificity and that it's kind of the right tone and mood and for your classroom, the sort of the atmosphere that you want to create. Thank you. That's very useful. We do have some questions coming in. So our first one is from John Sampson, who asks, at present, what has worked in motivating learners to not use AI as a shortcut, and what key things encourage them to take the stairs? Thank you, John.
Um, I would say it's a struggle. I'm going to be honest. It is a struggle, particularly with A-level students. There is a component of English where there's a coursework component. So we have to be, it comes back to those intrinsic motivations I know Cillian mentioned earlier, and ensuring that we actually are assessing their writing process as well. And we have done a lot of work on looking at this is AI generated, this is human, and looking at the nuances of the language and the subtleties of the language and getting them to appreciate and understand that that is what they're aiming for. They're not aiming to replicate the same description, the same metaphors, which actually is very interesting. We did an experiment where we put in it was an image and it was to describe a face, and they all came out with the same slight variation of the same description, which one of them sounded amazing, but when you compare them, 15 of them side by side, you realize there's no authenticity about it. So we've done work around authenticity, and really it does come back to appealing to their intrinsic motivation. Um, but it is, I will caveat that it's an uphill struggle, and it's very tempting not to take stairs, I would say.
Just one thing I've learned from teachers using Pulc. I'm not sure I support this idea of motivation, but it does seem to appear semi-frequently, which is that teachers have reported a good way of motivating students to actually not use it is to make it clear to them in the exam they won't be able to use it. As that's where handwriting becomes a particularly effective. I'm not necessarily. I don't think that's a very intrinsic way of motivating people, but it's one pragmatic way. It's maybe a bit more carrot than stick, but it seems to work in some cases at least.
Thank you. It's hard for all of us not to want to take the lift, isn't it? So I understand the temptation. Yeah. Okay, we can squeeze in probably another one. So Estonia has recently partnered with and rolled out OpenAI Edu in schools to promote AI literacy and broad adaptation. How do you feel about that move?
Can I answer that one, Maud? And
Yeah.
welcome your thoughts as well. But I have two thoughts about that. The first is I'm very skeptical um, about sort of big tech, big ed tech, and deals with national governments. For a few reasons. First of all, I think national syllabi are very important. In fact, they tend to respond to specific contexts in the country or region. I'm not sure large language models like ChatGPT are set up for that. And I'm not sure the scaffolding really that's been put around the edu version of ChatGPT deals with the problem that ultimately the fact that it can do this education stuff is sort of it is accidental as a property of LLMs. But I'm not, a lot of it seems to rely on Socratic questioning and sort of, I'm not sure how well informed it is by pedagogy and how much of it is partially a marketing aspect. So I'm a bit skeptical about that. I'm very worried at universities as well as in schools about uh, lock in from these large tech companies, which I think is partially motivating things as well. Not to be overly cynical about things, but the idea of while these things aren't, while open source AI isn't such a big thing to get people to sign up and then increase costs of subscriptions for some of the basic models we have for your Google Classroom and so on. So that would be my reading of that, which may appear cynical, but I think it's somewhat concerning.
Yeah, I would just I hear the skepticism. I would say it's encouraging to hear a country investing. I think it was a bit disappointing when we look at the funding that was given by the government to investing in AI in education. Was a tiny proportion of the overall budget for. I think it's the tech budget in general. I'm not sure exactly, but so I think I share your skepticism again on perhaps motivation and the accidental nature of some of that ed tech AI. However, I think it's positive, like I said before, that actually there is a growing movement around investing specifically in that.
Thank you both very much. Now, we could grab a couple of extra minutes. Cillian, if you would like to share with us your critique of Duolingo, because I think we're all fascinated by a model which has achieved kind of global success. What's going on there? Tell us more.
Yeah, so Duolingo is really well regarded in the investment world because it grows organically. It's considered a big ed tech story in terms of success. It's obviously an extremely valuable company. Um, it's a great company and an awful education tool. I would go as far as to say I'm not actually sure it even is an education tool. Um, I think it's an entertainment or a game. And I think that's one of the problems with gamification, which is connected to how we design these tools, because Duolingo's primary aim is to get people to return to use Duolingo every day. That sort of bullies people with the streaks and so on. But that's presented as a sort of active recall idea. But in fact, what they're really trying to get you, they're not focused on providing you with educational content that will make you actually gradually go up that stairs, let's say, but more keep you exactly on the same step. Um, so, for instance, its view of language tends to break language down into just a set of words that you must learn. And I think the proof is and that's very useful because that's what the technology is good at, right? So that's where it's been designed with the technology can provide the lists and have the missing word and so on, but it's not really, in my view, informed by this is how you would teach somebody a language at all. And that is why people use it for years and can't speak the language. That is the basic problem. And I'm not going to mention them, but there is someone I know very well who is in 1,000-day streak on Duolingo and she cannot speak a word of Korean. So, I mean, and I think that's just universal because at the end of the day, it's just an entertainment or a game designed to make you somewhat feel good about yourself because it's slightly got a lot of cultural capital learning languages or learning the other skills you have on it. But I'm not sure it's designed with education in mind. It started from what can the technology do? And then how can we present this as education? And similarly with the active recall thing as well, actually, it's a good business model to get people to come back all of the time because then you can advertise more to them. So that's my big concern and critique with Duolingo, and particularly as someone who's passionate about people learning languages, I think it has done a lot of damage to make people think this is what learning a language is, which is just breaking down language into a set of words that you must learn. To and every time I made this point, I've yet to meet someone who's actually learned a language with Duolingo. And I think people often get a shock when they then go on holidays and realize that they're not able to order a beer, even though they know all of the words for that, but for some reason aren't able to use it. Well, I think it'd be like teaching a mechanic how to drive a car by literally breaking up every single bit of an engine, but never actually showing them an engine. Basically, that's my critique.
Well, thank you very much. And actually, you've brought us almost sort of back full circle, almost like we planned it, to, thinking about the AI tools that you want to embed in your classroom and that they have been designed for that purpose, preferably with your subject, in mind, but definitely with the students, at the heart, and the aim of freeing up the teacher to do more of what it is that they so expertly do. Well, thank you, Maud and Cillian. That has been a wonderful session where we've all learnt a lot. So thank you. Thank you also to everybody who has joined us. It's been a real pleasure to have you. So we'll say goodnight, enjoy your evenings, and I hope you can join us at another session again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Becky.
you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Thanks, Maud.
Thank you.